effect. Thank you very much.
Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. I speak in support of Clause 124, tabled by my honourable friend, the member of Carl Shorten, and new Clause 27, tabled by the honourable member of Brighton Pavilion, and I'm very pleased that he's here to introduce it later on. Ms. Hansen, what is the biggest long-term issue facing people here in Britain and across the world? It's not Brexit, it's not the world economy, it's climate change and the environment. For decades, we have thoughtlessly exploited our planet, heated the atmosphere and polluted the earth. The price we pay for continuing as before is enormous. As part of the European Union, Britain is making progress to tackle the problem. We have together signed up to the Paris Agreement. Many European laws and regulations, which are our laws, have been a force for good and have nudged the UK towards better environmental protection and better protection for human health. And it was possible through the effective enforcement of these laws by EU agency and the European Commission. The withdrawal bill carries the risk that we scrap our commitments that we have shared with the EU to go it alone or throw our lot in with America or anyone else. I want this country to become the greenest in the world. Before I became an MP, I was closely involved in improving how we dealt with our household and commercial waste following the EU landfill directive. Landfill produces a potent greenhouse gas, methane, and diverting landfill waste through recycling, composting and waste reduction is the only way of stopping this greenhouse gas getting into the atmosphere. The UK is still one of the worst recyclers in the developed world. There have just been figures out the other day. We have a long way to go and wouldn't have gone half the way without the EU pushing us in the right direction and the effective enforcers of the European Enforcement Agency and the European Commission. And yes, today we have talked for a while that the UK has been leaders in particular legislation in the EU. And that is, of course, the beauty of the EU. In some areas, we are leaders. In other areas, for example, about air pollution, other countries have been leaders. And together, we have produced this body of legislation that makes us all better for it. Another example, of course, for good EU legislation is our beaches and how they have cleaned up following EU directives. British beaches are now 99% clean and safe. That is what the EU has done for us. The environment is owned by everybody. The environment is not a person or legal entity that can complain. Private ownership in a deregulated world does not protect the environment. That is why the legal principles underpinning EU law, as well as powerful and independent enforcement bodies, are so essential. Frankly, I'm not reassured by government ministers. The recent debacle over the Brexit impact assessment or the war of words over regulatory alignment or divergence are prime examples why we should not be bamboozled by fine words, but keep an eagle and watchful eye over every move of this government. The draft bill on animal welfare that has now been produced in a panic is not at all reassuring, but an example of how all the government can do in the face of Brexit is to firefight. And indeed, the biggest problem for me is that Brexit has to happen in this enormous rush and the apparent need to undo, in a very short month, laws, regulations, enforcements, cooperation and partnership that have evolved over 40 years. The protection of the environment depends on cross-border cooperation. The environment is not a game of politics. It is the one thing that can either guarantee or endanger our own survival. So the next best thing to stay in the EU would be to stay in the single market and the customs union. This alone would protect the high standards for the environment, health, safe employment, consumer protection and animal rights, and the oversight of these enforcements by independent agencies. And this is why everybody in this House should support the amendment by my honourable friend, the member of Carl Scholten, which would ensure that during the transition period, while we are still operating within the single market, this bill in front of us will not undermine EU regulations and enforcement. And at the very least, we should set up independent regulatory bodies which are effective and have enough tooth to hold powerful organisations, powerful global companies and industries and individuals to account. New Clause 27 would allow this to happen. It would be great, of course, to think and count on everybody to do the right thing. Experience tells us otherwise, and environmental crimes continued unfettered where there aren't powerful laws and powerful enforcement agencies. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if Brexit meant that we align ourselves with Trump's America, pulling out of the climate change agreement, expanding our fossil fuel industry, undermining our renewable industry, energy industry, trampling over environmental protection laws and sitting idly by as the planet warms up? Climate change is not Project Fear, it is a worrying and brutal reality. I started with saying, Mr. Hansen, that climate change is the biggest challenge for our age, bigger than Brexit. What a tragedy if the environment and vital action to tackle climate change would be the biggest victim of Brexit.